Welcome back to Beyond the Hyphen. I'm Mark Lee, your host. Today, I am privileged to be joined by Maryland State Delegate Gabriel Moreno, who represents District 13 in Howard County. Before entering elected office, Delegate Moreno worked across immigration advocacy, nonprofit leadership, education, law, and most recently serving as CEO of Luminous, an organization supporting immigrant communities from more than 90 countries across the state of Maryland. Born and raised in El Paso, Texas, to immigrant parents from Mexico, Delegate Moreno brings a perspective to public service shaped by identity, community, and grassroots advocacy. Now, in today's conversation, we'll explore his journey from leadership in the immigration advocacy sphere, the evolving role of young people in civic life, as well as what meaningful representation and belonging looks like in one of the nation's most diverse communities. Delegate Moreno, thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
So, Delegate Moreno, you were born and raised in El Paso to immigrant parents, and now you represent one of the most, again, diverse districts in Howard County in the state of Maryland. I'm curious, when you look back on your childhood and the environment that you grew up in, what experiences most shaped the way that you think about advocacy, belonging, and community today?
I mean, for me, coming from El Paso, there isn't a lot of diversity there. You're looking at 80 to 90% of individuals being Hispanic descent, mostly growing up. For the most part, I think everybody was Mexican. I just didn't think I never thought to like ask or question, where people came from. I just kind of thought everybody was, immigrated from Mexico. And being a naive or in my ignorance, my understanding of asylum, or not asylum, but immigration, was if anybody wanted to come to the United States, they could just immigrate to the United States. I didn't understand the complexities of what I would learn, after law school and getting into the space. But it wasn't until I moved to law school in New England and then came down here that I started being exposed to a lot more diversity. Um, so yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, Texas is a huge state, right? It's a huge state with a lot of different, I would say, bubbles of communities across the state. But
Oh,
I think
it is. Yeah, El Paso is far west Texas. Sometimes people don't think it's part of Texas. It's so far away.
right.
And you kind of see it just kind of the way it's kind of sandwiched between New Mexico and Mexico, the country. And it's just, and a lot of the time when you go places, people will typically talk to you in Spanish initially,
Mhm.
because they just think that you speak Spanish. And luckily I am fluent in Spanish, so it works out in my favor. But it feels like there's not a lot of diversity in El Paso at the end of the day. Yeah.
Gotcha. Gotcha. Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think that gave an interesting perspective, right? Before you moved here and then now being here and also before politics. I mean, you spent time working as a substitute teacher, an immigration attorney, and like I mentioned earlier, eventually leading Luminous, which serves immigrants across Maryland. Now, none of those roles exist in a bubble, right? So how did those experiences gradually pull you toward something like public service and now being in elected office?
Yeah, I think I mean, they kind of shape my outlook on life. It does sometimes feel like a lot of the roles that I took on came up by chance. Initially out of law school, I did civil practice, mostly on the civil side of law, torts, personal injury, landlord tenant, anything that didn't have to deal with the criminal defense side of things in a private law firm. And during that time is when I volunteered for an immigration nonprofit called Kids in Need Defense. I volunteered about a year and a half, 2 years, and then their funding expanded and they were able to hire more individuals, attorneys especially. And that's how I was, into that role as an immigration attorney, mentoring pro bono attorneys at various levels from solo practice all the way to huge law firms. And during that time, I didn't think I was going to be at Kids in Need Defense for 8 years, but it went by so fast. The first 3 years, it was mostly helping unaccompanied minor. Those are children that come to the United States without a parent or a guardian. They present at the border, and then the children are transferred to shelters that are funded by the federal government through the Office of Refugee Resettlement. And they do the work to reunite the child with some family member. Sometimes it's mom, sometimes it's dad, or some other relative that's been living in the United States. And part of the reason that a lot of those children come is because they were left with the grandparents who are older. There's just nobody else to take care of the child. Gang violence. There's all sorts of reasons that a lot of these kids come, but a lot of the time it was the gang violence coming in Central America. Um, and then as time progressed, family separations happened under the first Trump administration, and it started in 2017. Wasn't publicly known until about spring 2018, when Jeff Sessions made the announcement that the zero tolerance policy was occurring as a deterrent from people coming to the United States. And that led me into a 5-year stint where I was trying to reunite as many families as possible, working with the ACLU, Justice in Motion, um, Paul Weiss it's a huge law firm. They were also involved. Several, individuals and groups were involved in that effort. And we tried the best to get solutions such as settlement agreements and negotiations, but it was definitely I thought it was going to be a 2-year project to reunite families, but it I mean, like I said, I was there 5 years, and then that's when I moved to Luminous, and the work till today it's still going on, and if anything, it's expanded now because what we saw with zero tolerance policy was families were being separated at the border, but now in the last year, close to year and a half, we're seeing the amount of families that are being separated in the interior of the United States. It's just so it seems like the federal government doesn't want anything to do with reuniting families. They're just indiscriminately picking up people. We're seeing more than 80% of people that have been detained from January 2025 to February 2026 having zero criminal history, for example. So you're talking about people that have possibly been here for years, even decades, being picked up and getting sent all over the United States, and then potentially getting deported without having the ability to talk to their attorney if they have one.
Mhm.
So a lot of that I think has shaped me. To answer your question, I think a lot of what I've seen, it's a lot of the decisions made by individuals to create the policies, for example, zero tolerance policy, where it's designed in a way to be a deterrent from people coming to the United States.
Mhm.
Somebody made that decision. And there's been other policies I've seen throughout immigration during my time there that it's people making these decisions with the theory or hypothesis that it'll somehow deter people from coming to the United States, or all of a sudden turn people into um, undocumented status. So, the messaging, the rhetoric was that they were going to go after everybody that's undocumented. And
Mhm.
what we've seen, there's policies that are ending, for example, temporary protected status. That's something that if someone comes from a country where the government's been destabilized or there's some kind of climate disaster that's occurred and it's unsafe for a person to be there, the Department of State will make a decision to say, if you come to the United States, you can be here for a temporary, time, but then it has an expiration date, and there's times where they renew those. But what we've seen is that this administration is actively trying to let them expire without renewing. So then you put people in a situation where now all of a sudden they're documented. So, there's certain policies that are being made to fit the rhetoric and the messaging that's coming out of, like, for example, the current administration. So when you see those types of things, when I look at the types of policies or the bills that I want to introduce, I want it to make a positive impact instead of having a negative impact, as we're seeing a lot of these executive orders and policies coming out of the federal administration. I, of course, am at the state level, so I have to understand, my scope and the powers that I have in the state to bring laws that will impact Marylanders.
Right. Right. But I mean, the work that is being done at the state is very important as well, because it also trickles down to counties and even smaller districts. And I think that, especially being in a state like Maryland and having leaders and having partners in the state house, in Governor Westmore, in Lieutenant Governor Miller, their cabinet, I think Maryland has been an example state for other states to sort of try to emulate. And I think that that also starts from the state senate, the state house, and how well we can work across the aisle as well.
Oh, 100%. I mean, it's a lot of, I mean, when we talk about Governor Westmore, we talk about Lieutenant Runa Miller, um, and various other people, the Speaker of the House, Jocelyn Melnick. Not only are they empathetic, for example, to immigrants, but some of them have gone through that immigration story.
Right, right.
And I think that brings a certain level to your understanding of what happens day to day for a lot of residents that are in, for example, in these mixed documented status homes. There's mixed immigration status homes. One in, I think it's 15 households in all the United States have some type of, there's a U.S. citizen, there's an undocumented person, there's somebody that's trying to get documented. It's gonna be a long process depending on what they're trying to go for. So when we talk about diversity being our strength, that diversity, it puts people in a room where they understand what the struggle is. A lot of the times people will say we have a lot of battlefronts, but we have one giant struggle, and I feel like we're all united in that one struggle to get to a place where people feel safe, people feel happy. When we talk about the pursuit of happiness, when the framers decided to put, the pursuit of happiness, it's there. And what does that look like? Um, Trying to figure out what that is to make life better for folks.
Yeah. You mentioned diversity being such a defining factor in Howard County, and I agree.
Mm.
Getting the opportunity to represent Howard County is getting the opportunity to represent just countless groups of diverse people, and also considering how great of an education system that Howard County has. You're serving a community again with a large population of young people as well, right, from many different backgrounds, including myself, including young kids who don't even, I would say, have a grasp of what the civic system is, or say they're in elementary school and in preschool, entering the education system, participating in programs like ESOL, right, like the many programs that Howard County offers and is privileged to offer that other counties may not. And so from that perspective, having such a resourced county, what makes Howard County special? And where do you think young people here, being a platform where we try to highlight young people's voices and educate young people, where do you think young people here still feel unseen or disconnected?
I think a lot of it has to deal with a lot of kids don't have places to go, or that's an ongoing discussion. We talk about the 50 plus population needing the places to socialize and exist. We have the 50 plus centers. But then when we talk about teenagers and kids, like where do they get to go? With the mall, it is a private entity, so they put certain restrictions on when teenagers, for example, can be there, by themselves, or kids, they have to have the guardian with them. So it's a matter of trying to find space for kids, I think, is one of the things we should try to be focusing on. I know with like Columbia Community Care, they have the source building that they're trying to focus on in the Wild Lake space, but that potentially will, hopefully there'll be kids not just in Wild Lake going to hang out there, and then just trying to identify other spaces beyond libraries, beyond their own schools. We definitely have to focus on that. I've always been impressed by a lot of the, for example, high school students that I've met during my time here in Howard County, because they're just so motivated to be involved in various ways in the community, whether it's volunteering, like with Columbia Community Care, like I mentioned earlier, or other various nonprofits that exist, or getting involved in campaigns, political campaigns. Every 2 years we have an election going on, and I'm always impressed when I go to a coordinated office and I see all these teenagers, they're volunteering their time and knocking doors, making phone calls. I think that's a really, really cool thing. Going back to the whole diversity aspect, I think if we're able to see more and more kids from diverse backgrounds, younger kids will see that and they can see themselves doing those roles just the same way that I see myself as Hispanic Latino, um, child of immigrants, in these spaces where I'm in elected office. Like a lot of kids, I hope to inspire that they can see themselves in me to be able to pursue something like that they're not held back. I will say that for me personally, it wasn't easy to get to where I've been. I always, when anytime I talk to younger folks, I talk about as you go on through life, you'll have a lot of that imposter syndrome where, for me, I didn't see a lot of people in spaces that look like me. So I had to like kind of just throw myself out there and live my life with no fear. Things worked out. And that's what I like to tell a lot of younger folks. It's, get the imposter syndrome out of your brain, just kind of go through the flow of life and put yourself in spaces and difficult situations, and when you look back, like it won't look as difficult as you thought it was, I
Mhm.
guess you could say. So yeah.
Yeah, I agree with that. Being someone who's Asian American, it's very, I think, frequent when I find myself in a space that's not dominated by, people who look like me, or I walk in and the diversity sort of count goes up by 100%. Um, but
Mhm.
I say all that to say, like, going back to the major part of your work before the legislator being, or before the legislature being involved in immigration work, you've worked with not just, immigrants from South America, or immigrants from areas close to America, but also other places. I'm supposing, and I think that that gives such a unique perspective on the fabric of Howard County and the makeup of Howard County, different needs, right? Despite being
Mhm.
so, I think, universalized in what the narrative paints as a well-off county, as a county doing very well, doing, very, I think, well in terms of both education and financially, housing, yet but there's so many things that we have to improve on within the county as well. And so being so close to their stories, to these immigrants, being so proximate, how did that shape your understanding of what our government is supposed to do for the people, and particularly those who depend more on it than perhaps their neighbor?
I mean, the idea as a whole for the entire United States, I always think that we're supposed to be like a safe haven for the rest of the world a lot of the time. There are some folks that want to put a stop to immigrants coming to the United States, whether it's documented or undocumented. But when you look at the Statue of Liberty, the poem that's there is, by Lazarus talking about "Give me your huddled masses." Um, when we look at Howard County, I would like to say that we could potentially be a safe haven for immigrants, but part of the struggles that we're seeing that are faced by not just immigrants, but just everybody. It's the cost of living and what that entails when you're talking about housing. How much is the average apartment cost in Howard County? What areas, do people want to live in? The cost of groceries. I myself, even though I'm an elected official, I am also resident in Howard County, so I see the bills when it comes to electric bills and the gas prices, and it's um it's pretty shocking sometimes. I'm like, oh my God, why would you? It's like Howard County is such a great place, but to be able to afford Howard County, for again, per time out personally, my wife and I, both work. We've always had to work to make ends meet, and we have two kids, and so it definitely shapes the way you see the policies that you try to kind of introduce. But I mean, those are some of the types of difficulties that we need to figure out better ways to be able to help, if immigrants are able to get to Howard County and trying to help them, and hopefully we're able to do what we can to help them out. In the last couple of years, we've seen the crisis in Ukraine, the war. We've seen with Afghanistan when we pulled out of there. So we've seen a lot of refugees coming from, those are two of, of many other countries where people are coming to the United States, and some folks have had to come through Howard County. Sometimes they stay here for a while and then they move on to somewhere else because they might get priced out, or it might be a difficult situation where they can't find a job. That's another situation where if you can't find a job, the resources that are allowed or given to folks, they can, get to a point where they expire.
Mhm.
So,
Yeah. Yeah, and you mentioned making the right choices in policy making to
mhm.
alleviate sort of the tensions for the everyday person in Howard County. And that sort of brings me toward when you recently introduced legislation around limiting the use of seclusion rooms and restraints in juvenile settings. And I think that issue gets at a broader conversation about how society treats young people when they struggle or make mistakes, as well as an implication, if you will, of some sorts of how our criminal justice system is designed. And I think among the issues, I'm really, really curious as to what pushed you toward that issue specifically out of the pool of issues in the state. Why that issue?
Yeah, no, when I got to the legislature, I was sworn in the day before this last session started. So, I was trying to kind of figure out different legislation that I would introduce. And, with my experience helping unaccompanied minor immigrant children, seeing how they're treated in a lot of detention settings, some of these children's shelters, some of the camps on military bases that I had the privilege to see firsthand. Um, this was the piece of legislation dealing with restrictive housing was something that was kind of being introduced previously by my current chair, Delegate Sandy Bartlett. And so I, asked her to take it on. And I was able to work with the Department of Juvenile Services to come to the agreement that they would adopt regulations to deal with restrictive housing because we don't have those regulations in Maryland. There's federal legislation that passed. It was via executive order under Obama. I believe it was 20, uh, when was it? I think it was 2014, I think. But anyways, and then it ended up actually like becoming law in 2018 under the first Trump administration. It was bipartisan legislation that was put restrictions such as no more than 6 hours in restricted housing. Um, because we've seen situations or stories where people are being held for long periods of time. We need to make sure that people are getting their meals, or getting like health checks, because a lot of people don't understand when somebody is secluded from others, and they have no source of entertainment, whether it's reading or TV or being engaged. Like it definitely does something to a person.
Right. I
Being in solitude. So I decided I would take it on. I was able to get it out of the house, but trying to get it passed in the Senate was another situation that just didn't make it. But I'm gonna try to reintroduce it, and hopefully I'm able to get it passed the next session. Um, but that's one of the ways that I decided to come across that piece of legislation to see if we could get it past the finish line.
Yeah, and I think on a personal level, I'm also really interested in things like, being an attorney for not big corporations, but for the everyday person, right? Being civil rights attorneys, and then fighting, like you mentioned, making sure that someone doesn't spend egregious hours by themselves in prison. I think a lot of these privatized sort of relationships with private prisons, it introduces a lot of gray area where regulations might not specifically be able to enforce, and seeing a lot of ICE detention centers not allowing our legislators, our congressional um, representatives to conduct oversight. It's quite frankly concerning, and I think there's a lot of clarity that needs to be achieved when it comes to that. Um, but yeah, that's just another, I think, frustration and point of analysis that a lot of young people are sort of dealing with right now, because there's a point of being motivated to do work and to be participative in the legislative process, in civics, but then there's that sense of cynicism because they don't see that the system is following the rules. They don't see the system is sort of working smoothly. For you, Delegate Moreno, where's that sort of what's your message to the young people who are feeling that cynicism more than that motivation and that hope?
I mean, I think what a lot of young folks, and just anybody in general, has to understand that specifically, I mean, with this administration, it's trying to flood the zone. And I mean, they've even said it. I think Steve Bannon was the one that said it years ago. It's getting in power and then flooding the zone. passing so many, or signing so many executive orders and putting out so much things left and right to basically burn people out. I think it's a big strategy, and there have been, people that feel like it's better to tune out because it's so much happening. Whether it's a monument trying to get built, a ballroom trying to get built, um, trying to sell cell phones, all the craziness that, for example, with President Carter, we made we made him let go of his peanut farm because it just sounded too unethical for him to keep it when he became president. To now seeing that we're seeing the cryptocurrency, we're seeing all these things, and then immigration itself, the amount of policies that are being instituted there, it's for me, I question, if I want to continue in immigration law or at least take a break from it because it's just every day it feels so overwhelming. Going back to when we look at like the restrictive housing or the private prisons, immigration detention, just the way it's been weaponized to hurt so many people. It's very demoralizing. It really does burn you out, but you have to try to keep on fighting. So I guess my message is, try not to get burned out. Take breaks, take naps, drink water. But I mean, the fight continues on. The resistance continues on, and I mean, we have to keep pushing back. I mean, we just have no other we have no other option, really. It's, we've seen for example, with politics, when we look at the number of folks that have decided to become independent, I think is a very good marker of how much people want to be disengaged from party politics. They want to be independent and not say they're Democrat, don't say that they're Republican. They want individuals without having to look at the letter at the end of their name to say whether or not they're going to support people. And I don't think I judge that, or I don't see look down upon them, because that, there are times where I am disappointed on certain decisions that, I, as a Democrat, my party has made in the last couple of years. And so, I mean, I think people need to just continue to be engaged, and trust that, we'll get out of, this mess. It will take time to rebuild.
Hmm.
The sad thing about a lot of the things that we've seen, um, is that it's very easy to break down systems. Now to build them back up, it's gonna be very chaotic. And I'm talking about like the Department of Education. I mean, we
Yeah.
saw what happened with USAID. Everything that Doge did, that like here we are. It's a dismantling of so many federal agencies. It's very disappointing to see, but I think my biggest message is, to keep pressing on, ask questions, get involved. I think in the coming years we'll start to see more and more young people hopefully running for office. As I said earlier, throw the imposter syndrome out. If you're a 25-year-old and think you can't run for office, if the seat is there to run for it and there's no age restriction, sometimes you have to be over a certain age, whether it's 18, 21, or 25, to run for certain seats. Go for it. um there's plenty of different groups out there that can definitely help you in your race.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, looking at you, Delegate Moreno, your whole journey, your profile, I think is a source of inspiration for many. You're someone who represents multi sort of dimensional identity simultaneously, right? You're, Latino, some immigrants, attorney, nonprofit leader, the list goes on. Now elected official serving the state legislature,
Mhm.
after being active in your party locally. In today's political climate, do you ever feel pressure to represent an entire community or one community, one narrative? And how do you stay authentic to yourself, right? Your micro sort of level self, as opposed to carrying, for example, the community of Latino citizens on your shoulders? Or do you ever feel that pressure and having to balance that?
No, not necessarily. I think I think a lot of different advocacy groups, lobbyists, constituents, like with they're trying. I think, like I said earlier, there are a lot of battlefronts, but it's like one struggle, and that's kind of what like makes me be able to continue on and fight for what, in my opinion, is right. In my discussions with various groups to come to an agreement of what is right. Um, I don't. Yeah, I to be honest, I don't think I feel the pressure of it all because I think if you're able to have a conversation with it, whether it's constituent or an advocacy group, and you're in agreement, protecting the Chesapeake Bay, the environment,
Yeah.
fighting the the development and building of AI centers as we're seeing today. There are various places in the United States that all of a sudden they're telling ratepayers to, residents to start limiting their use of water. Like it's go to those things like for one day to the next. It's like, hey, stop using so much water. It's it's one of those situations where it's just one big struggle where we're putting it on the people, the masses, to put it on their shoulders to solution. When we talk about recycling, for example, when we talk about the plastic industry, talking about how like everybody is in on this battle. We all have to recycle our plastics. But then when you think about it, it's like the consumer is not the one that's created the plastic. It's the Coca-Cola, the Pepsi, all these companies. But then they put it on the consumer, and the same thing as we're seeing again with like AI centers, where all of a sudden a lot of people's electric bills are going up because a lot of these AI centers are using huge amounts of electricity. They're using, drinkable water to cool down, and then they throw this polluted water into our ecosystem.
Mhm.
And all of a sudden, like we're supposed to help them out. Like you're basically the all the profit is going to the owners while they're socializing the cost. Like everybody has to take it on. So to answer your question, I mean, I don't, up to this point, I haven't really felt the pressure from one group or another. If anything, with a lot of the groups that I've talked to, I think we're kind of in agreement, what it is that we want to do, such as when the ACLU in Maryland and CASA in Action were, pushing for a lot of the legislation that we saw, getting rid of 287G.
Mhm.
Right now, with the Community Trust Act and the Maryland Privacy, those two, they're going to be laws, even though they're not going to be signed into law, they're going to be laws. And, those types of things, for example, yes, the immigrant community and a lot of folks are putting pressure on it, but at the same time, it's like, well, your pressure is pushing me in the direction that I'm going. So I'm kind of riding the current, I guess you could say, that of that pressure.
Gotcha. Yeah, yeah. Because balancing, I think, being someone who has the privilege of holding so many identities, and
Mm,
even just in a sense of representation, seeing, for example, Delegate Wu facing those anti-Asian remarks, and having being someone who's Asian American, right? I hold my pride in seeing him stand up firm, maybe not like very specific policy wise, but just seeing him being there, showing young Asian Americans that you act this way when hateful messages are perpetuated toward you. And I think that was where I was going with that sentiment. And seeing you fight for so many communities is also very inspirational, in a
yeah.
county that sort of hinges on that diversity, right? That's whose success is very contingent on how well we take advantage of that diversity, and who we talk to, right? How willing we are to talk to different groups. And I think that for a lot of policymakers, they sort of just get into office, sit there, do their own thing, and then um, get out of the constituents' reach. And I'm just really glad that we can hold each other accountable. And through this
Mm,
platform, I'm trying to educate our young sort of citizens and constituents on how to hold our policymakers accountable, and how to even become policymakers ourselves. But I think it's very important to have conversations like these. And so as we wind down,
mm.
looking back on your journey again across advocacy, law, nonprofit leadership, what do you hope young people we talked about this a little bit, but just on a general sort of last uh, piece of advice or thing you would say to young people is, what do you hope young people understand about leadership, about belonging, and their own potential from seeing someone like you in these spaces?
Yeah, no, I when I talk to a lot of young folks, I talk about how their ability to learn and their power to get into various spaces is limitless. Like they just have to keep showing up, keep pushing, and doing everything they can. One of the things we saw when Delegate Chow Wu was attacked is it it's the reality we live in. Like racism exists, and it's not going to stop existing until we have more diversity in leadership roles. Um, it's sad to have seen that happen, and it's very important for young people to continue to stay engaged and call it out when you see it. um, right now we're not in session, but I'm pretty sure if we were in session we probably would have moved for a censure, because we have seen people elected in the past, for example in the legislature even before I was there, that have said some crazy things and racist things, and the Maryland legislature has moved forward with censuring and anything else that that's deemed necessary. So when it comes to young folks, don't be discouraged when you see things like that. Call it out. And especially in your own spaces when you're in school, when you're in high school, you'll see things like what happened to Dr. Wu in high school, and you have to call it out. And so I would say continue showing up and doing what you can to stay engaged. There are always countless internships, fellowships that exist in whether it's at the Maryland General Assembly, whether you want to intern at the Capitol Hill, the governor's office. There are a lot of opportunities out there. You just have to seek them out, and don't be scared. I think that's one of the things that I've always tried to, you know, live my life showing up in various spaces. Even if there was some fear, I still threw myself into spaces, and like I said, it's worked out. Um, and don't be scared to pivot to other things as well in your studies. I'll sometimes talk about my undergraduate career where I started with engineering and then pivoted to philosophy because 2 years in I just didn't want to be an engineer anymore, and then at some point I decided to go to law school, and I don't know, here I am, delegate. So did I plan to be a delegate in my early 40s? By no means did I, but life has worked out and for me in this way, and I'm very, like I said, I'm very, very blessed. And if anybody ever wants to reach out for mentorship or anything like that, I try to be as available as possible.
Yeah. Well, Delegate Moreno, beautifully said. Thank you again for taking the time to join me today and for sharing your perspective so openly. I really appreciate not only the work that you continue to do for immigrant communities and I mean everyone, young people across Maryland, but also I think your willingness to have thoughtful conversations like this about identity, the intersection of belonging, public service. So it was definitely a true pleasure for me to speak with you today.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mark. It was great talking to you too.